Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. For today's episode in our series about the great counterfactuals, I'm talking to the historian of Russia, Edward Acton, about how the Russian Revolution could have turned out very differently. What if not the Bolsheviks, but the Left SRs, the left socialist revolutionaries, had come out on top? How might the revolution have been different? How might the history of the world have been different? We should probably start with the February Revolution in 1917. There were, as I'm sure many people know, two revolutions in 1917, and we are going to come on for our big counterfactual to the second one, the October Revolution, but it only really makes sense in the context of the February Revolution. So maybe you could sketch out for us just what the political landscape in Russia looked like after that revolution. It's known now, it was known then, as the Liberal Revolution. So this isn't a socialist revolution, this is the collapse of the Tsarist regime and its replacement with something that professed to stand for constitutional order, the rule of law, democracy, and so on. Where did that leave the revolutionary left in Russia?
Well, in a remarkably powerful position, because after the February Revolution, the liberals discovered that a trapdoor had opened beneath them, and that all the Tsar's hierarchy, the police, the army, local government, were unusable. Moreover, with the Tsar disappeared his little-loved parliament, the Duma, which never met again. So the liberal leaders, the constitutional Democrats, were known nationally, but they had no source of legitimacy and very little control over what happened below. A great upsurge of popular organizations elbowed aside the kind of institutions they would have relied on. So their only hope was to form a government. And luckily for them, the socialist leaders who were being carried high on a tide of popular demands for change were very keen they form a government, which they did, but it was disastrous. The only way they could hold the act together at all was to say the war is everything. We must all unite against the Germans. Popular opinion was in the opposite direction. End the war. We want peace. So within 6 weeks, it collapsed, the Liberal government. The cadet leader was driven out of office. And the remaining cadets turned to the socialists and said, please form a coalition, or there would be no government, and the Germans would just walk in. So from very early, one can see liberalism is not the destiny.
So this then puts the socialist revolutionaries in Russia in a quandary. They have to make a choice, which is, do they uphold this already failing liberal revolution and try and steer it in a different direction, or do they refuse to have anything to do with it? And a lot of that turns on the question of the war. So maybe we should flesh that out a bit too. The First World War has been a disaster for Russia at this point. The collapse of the Tsarist regime is partly a function of the fact that it had failed to prosecute the war in a successful way. There was disarray. But the world was moving in a different direction. So the United States entered the First World War in April 1917 and turned it into a war for democracy and held up the liberal revolution in Russia as an example of how the First World War finally made sense, because the parties that were aligned against Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire were the democracies now. Britain, France, United States, and Russia, this new, shining new democracy, except it wasn't. It was a complete fiasco. So what are the choices that the revolutionary socialists faced at this point? We'll come on to where the Bolsheviks fit into that, but taken in the round, what were their options? Was it to uphold this failing regime? Was it to wash their hands of the whole thing?
Well, it split them. Those who at the moment enjoyed ascendancy were the less extreme Marxists, jolly extreme, but less extreme, the Mensheviks, and the socialist revolutionaries, peasant-based, non-Marxist, but extremely radical. They had been carried to the summit in the Petrograd Soviet, the institution that took on national significance and was created overnight in the February Revolution, and in June, a congress of Soviets from across the country. Mensheviks and SRs absolutely dominated both. Both loathed the idea of propping up the bourgeois liberals, loathed it. They were very revolutionary. On the other hand, they did think we can't just allow a collapse. And nobody was up for signing a separate peace with Russia. They just wanted general peace with Germany. So the Mensheviks, who also did think Russia on its own can't have a socialist revolution, they were Marxists and they saw Russia as too little developed, in a way had the mentality to accept this is going to be a bourgeois phase. The SRs, it made no sense at all, but their leader, a hugely charismatic figure called Chernov, for reasons he never explained, when he got back to Russia, decided to row in with the Mensheviks, to become Minister of Agriculture in a bourgeois-led government, hope he could get on with some peasant reforms. And the result of those two parties joining the coalition was catastrophe for them. They found themselves supporting a new offensive against the Germans. Disastrous idea, but the bourgeois press was gung-ho that this we can do, and they committed their political capital to that offensive, which very rapidly turned into a complete fiasco, mass mutiny, and in no time, the opposite of gaining ground, the Russians were on retreat. So that very, very quickly, the Mensheviks and the sort of main visible body of the SRs had lost their credibility, and their popularity went like that from July to October. Catastrophic loss, leaving the field open to the Bolsheviks amongst workers and some soldiers, and left-wing minded SRs who loathed what Chernov had done but loved Chernov himself, to pick up the popular tide.
The effect, therefore, of the February Revolution, its aftermath, the attempt to keep going with the war, was to sort of strip away a large part of the socialist movement in Russia and, as you say, tie it to failure, leaving the Bolsheviks, who were still in a small minority within the wider socialist movement, and the bigger left socialist revolutionaries, the left SRs, to forge the alternative path, which is we need another revolution. So, as it were, you've had the attempt to take the revolution that happened and turn it into something that socialists could live with. That was a catastrophe. The hardliners, the ones who said we must have nothing to do with this because we are genuine socialist revolutionaries and this is not a socialist revolution, are then in a position to dominate what comes next. But it's not foreordained, is it, that the Bolsheviks are the ones who are going to determine what comes next. I think in my mind, I always thought that the field was cleared, a vacuum was created, and Lenin just stepped into it. But the left SRs, in many ways, were the more powerful wing of this movement that remained, the ones that had kept their purity. In part, as I understand it, because they were the representatives of the peasants. And this is still a peasant society. The reason the Mensheviks thought we're not going to get a revolution of the kind we want straight away is that we are not advanced enough as a society. We are not an industrialized society. The left SRs spoke for the peasants. So how powerful were they in the second half of 1917? As the liberal experiment collapsed and the people who had dipped their hands in that blood were destroyed by it, how powerful were the left SRs relative to the Bolsheviks?
Very powerful and on a rising tide, because peasant organization, mobilization, the creation of peasant Soviets and a hierarchy leading to a national Congress was slower, but its numerical base was 8 times the size of the urban one. So the more visible party were the Bolsheviks because they were stronger in the cities. But numerically, the cities were a tiny section of Russian society. And within the army, the Bolsheviks probably had slightly more support than the left SRs, but not by much. So that both parties in September said, right, we must have a second Congress of Soviets, and that must essentially appoint a socialist government. And it must govern at least until the long-awaited and long-delayed Constituent Assembly was to meet. So the question was, what would happen when this Congress, timed for the 25th of October, assembled in Petrograd? St. Petersburg had been renamed at the beginning of the war. And what would happen when it did so? So had that happened and we didn't have to bring in what Lenin insisted his party do, one would say the prospect was of an all-socialist government where there would be terrible tensions between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks and right SRs, and the party in the middle holding the center ground would be the left SRs, with probably an awful lot of right SR rank and file coming in behind them now that Chernov's brief sortie to the right had come to an end. So, as it were, left undisturbed by any special intervention, the tide looked very left SR.
Perhaps at this point, what we should then do is try and characterize what they stood for. If we're going to discuss the possibility of a Russian revolution that wasn't a Bolshevik revolution and how different a world that might have created, I would certainly benefit from knowing exactly how the left SRs differed. So you've mapped out a landscape which stretches from right to left. The Mensheviks and the right SRs, the right socialist revolutionaries, are towards one end of that spectrum. The left SRs and the Bolsheviks are towards the other end. So first of all, right to left, within the SR movement, right to left, was the central difference simply that one lot had propped up the liberals and the other lot had refused to have anything to do with them? Or were there deeper philosophical differences there?
There were sections of the SR party who, especially intelligentsia, who before the war had become markedly less radical. And they were in Petrograd when the February Revolution happened. So they got disproportionate prominence. But the vast bulk of the party was extremely united on their program. And what's distinctive about it is they regarded Russia as unique. Unlike the Marxists, they didn't think Russia's got to sort of more or less conform to the same pattern as the West. And though they had great respect for aspects of Marxist thinking, they didn't think there was any kind of timetable that Russia was bound to. Why? Because of the peasantry. And not just because 80% plus of the population were peasants, but because in Russia itself, the vast bulk of the population, the peasantry held the land collectively. They were organized and had been for generations in a thing called the peasant commune, which redistributed the land periodically amongst its members according to how many adults could work it, how many mouths there were to feed. And the SR said, what we want is to hand over all privately owned land to the commune, a commune from sea to sea. All Russia would be organized like that. And yes, over time, we hope they will begin to see the virtues of rather more larger scale and not strip farming, but the initiative will lie with them. Their ideological origins lie with Alexander Herzen, who famously said, we must not take the people for clay and ourselves for potters. The peasants will guide what happens. And the left SRs, for radical, very brutal and ruthless revolutionaries, were extraordinarily determined on collective control over power. And they meant it about peasants above all. That is sort of very near the opposite of the Bolshevik point of view, which was you nationalize the land and as quick as possible, you identify poor peasants, a sort of rural proletariat, you turn them against the rich peasants and you get them to work with the state to build collective farms. SRs thought that nonsense. There hardly are any poor peasants. They all belong to communes. Evidence that Lenin had found that there was a sort of differentiation between rich and poor turns out to be about the life cycle of every individual who, in their prime, looked rather rich, and when they were old, looked rather poor again. So that was the cardinal difference. Like the Bolsheviks, they wanted immediate peace. Like the Bolsheviks, they wanted a great deal more respect for workers and a whole raft of worker rights and state intervention where necessary to uphold industry.
So you could say the difference really turns on that question of whether Russia was or wasn't a promising place for a revolution, a socialist revolution, a communist revolution. In the Marxist account, the great puzzle for Marxists when the Russian Revolution finally happened was always, it wasn't meant to happen in Russia. It was going to happen in Germany. It was going to happen in the United States. It was going to happen in France. It was going to happen in Britain. It wasn't meant to happen in a peasant society. And therefore, Lenin had either performed some magic trick or indeed he'd contrived something out of nothing just by political ruthlessness. But it was very hard then to square the fact that the true revolution happened in Russia with the orthodox Marxist view of where the true revolution should happen, which was essentially in Germany. For the left SRs, that is not a problem. It is obvious why the revolution should happen in Russia, because Russia is the one society, the one major combatant in this war, this global war now, where there is a pre-existing communist form of organization. So, of course, this is the place that's best suited for a revolution when the war collapses. And for all the reasons that they presumably shared with the Bolsheviks, they thought that the war was a giant fraud perpetrated against the Russian people. But when the fraud is revealed, what there exists in Russia is actually something which already is organized in a way that suits the revolutionary goals of the movement. And that should give them a big advantage. The Bolshevik Revolution is a contrivance, even in its own terms, because it's a Marxist revolution happening in the place where a Marxist revolution is not meant to happen. The Left SR revolution is a natural event if you understand Russian history in that way. So for our what if, we have to now understand, why did the Left SRs lose out to the Bolsheviks? Because as you've described it, they had the numerical advantage. They were politically well-placed in late 1917. They had a more coherent ideological platform if the revolution was to happen in Russia. Was it just that they didn't have Lenin?
I suppose Lenin's personal intervention is pretty critical. 7 decades of Soviet historians tried to prove that the Bolshevik triumph was law-governed and inevitable, but also that Lenin was absolutely vital. Looking at the October Revolution, Lenin's intervention is critical. When he began saying, we must seize power before the Congress of Soviet meets, all his fellow Bolshevik leaders said, no. And they started not publishing his articles in the Bolshevik press, and they sort of more or less suppressed his early demands for planning for an uprising before the Congress. So that, without Lenin, it's very hard to see the Bolshevik Party deciding to preempt the Congress and seize power and proclaim the formation of a government wrapped up in the Soviet, but actually completely driven by the party. So the contingency is very fragile if it's just Lenin, and Lenin himself is opposed and opposed and opposed within the party. Across the cities, the notion of a one-party socialist government had nobody wanted that. They all wanted an all socialist government. And that's why Lenin's demands were refused. Trotsky said, no, we must fuse it with the Soviet Congress. We must do it in the name of the Soviet Congress, not in the name of the party, which is what they did. But the ingredient to add to your correct summary of the forces is that urban Russia, the Bolsheviks are stronger than the SRs numerically. So when the Congress meets and there aren't any peasant reps in it, the Bolsheviks do have the largest block of votes. And the SRs the left SRs are the second largest, but definitely smaller than the Bolsheviks. And the Bolsheviks looked to the left SRs for support. And after, for Lenin, a tantalizing, terribly dangerous moment, I think we should describe where the left SRs make their bid for an all-socialist government where they would be pivotal. It looked very possible that the Bolsheviks would fail in their démarche.
So let's describe that precarious moment. Could Lenin have been sidelined at that point? We know what happened. And so in the end, Lenin becomes the dominant figure, not just of the revolution, but one of the dominant figures of 20th century history. But at the moment when his fate was precarious, there were many forces that would have preferred an outcome at that point in the revolutionary cycle, which did not place Lenin at the head of the revolution. And presumably those forces could have joined together in some way to exclude him. How close did they come to doing that? How close did Lenin come to being frozen out in late 1917?
Very close. As soon as the Bolshevik initiative in seizing power and proclaiming the formation of a new government, with them essentially at the head of it. Actually, they named a thing called the Military Revolutionary Committee of the Soviet as the body that was taking control, and a left SR had chaired it. Nevertheless, in truth, they were proclaiming a Bolshevik government. The immediate reaction of the right-wing socialists was horror and stamping out of the Congress of Soviets. The left SRs said, this is monstrous. You promised us you would not preempt You swore you wouldn't. Trotsky and Stalin had 12 hours earlier said, no, we're planning absolutely nothing. And the Left SRs used one of their many organizations where they were dominant, the Union of Railway Workers, to force the Bolsheviks into negotiations for an all-socialist government. The railway union threatened to cut off Petrograd from supplies unless there were negotiations. At that stage, the Bolsheviks were very unsure in Petrograd how much the fallen government could mobilize force against them. And they were hearing that in Moscow, it was not going very easily, the announcement of Bolshevik power. So they were forced to negotiate. And some of the Bolsheviks, Kamenev most vigorously, were very keen to negotiate. They thought it disastrous, Lenin's experiment at one-party seizure of power. And on the 1st and 2nd of November, it looked very much like they'd come to an agreement. The Bolshevik press said an agreement is imminent. What happened, what went wrong, was that the right SR, when there was a virtual agreement on an all-socialist government, right-wing Menshevik and SR forces quite abruptly said, but we're not going to have Lenin or Trotsky in the government. They overplayed their hand. And at the same moment, it became plain that Kerensky's feeble efforts at intervening were failing, and Moscow, the Bolsheviks were gaining control. And so Lenin said, no more talks. Actually, even then, Kamenev went on talking for 12 more days, trying to reach an agreement with a lot of Bolshevik support. And then a lot of the Bolshevik leadership resigned when Lenin insisted. So I would say it came very close. And we're one to be absolutely hooked on the notion, no, Lenin is always going to emerge as the dominant ruler of Russia. Bear in mind that on the night they seized power, he said to Trotsky, you become chairman of the new government. And Trotsky decided not to. It's all extremely contingent.
But as you say, the right SRs and the Mensheviks overplayed their hand by trying to exclude Lenin. So it does sound like there wasn't a version of this all-socialist government in which Lenin wasn't playing a central role. And from what we know of Lenin, in the end, he had a tendency to assert himself. And whatever negotiations might have been underway, the direction of travel in his own mind was certainly towards one-party rule, the thing that he achieved in getting. Once the right of the socialist revolutionary movement had overplayed its hand and again left the field to the Left SRs and the Bolsheviks, and the Left SRs did agree to keep the Bolsheviks in power and essentially to prop up that government. You know, having decided not to prop up the liberal government, they did decide to prop up the Bolshevik government. Did they have any control? Did they have any hold over the direction of travel of that government in its early months? So the decisive point, which we will come to, happens in March 1918. That's when the big break comes. But post the October Revolution, there's a period of 4 or 5 months where Lenin is precariously in charge, but he is still dependent on Left SR support. These are two groupings that have very different views of the direction that the revolution should travel in, though they agree that the war must end. Could the Left SRs have steered the Bolsheviks in a different direction? Yes,
they did steer them on certain fronts in a different direction. They could have done much more. The institutional structure that evolved was very, very plastic. The Congress had been of workers and soldiers' deputies. But there was the question about, but what about the peasants' representatives? And the SR said, we must combine the Soviets of workers and soldiers with Soviets of peasants. The terms on which that was done was extremely debatable. And there were moments, and members of the SR party said, of course, it must be proportional representation. Had that been the case, the SRs would have had a massive majority in the Congress of Soviets, to which all Lenin rhetoric constantly referred. This is a Soviet government. It is all part of the Soviets. We are the instrument of the Soviets. Had the Left SRs insisted on the terms of that fusion, which would have given them a majority of the Congress of Soviets and the executive committee that existed between congresses, their leverage would have been enormous. They didn't. There was a fusion. The Left SRs had much more numbers, but it didn't do the peasants justice. Nevertheless, their influence was very real in those few months. I suppose critically, they insisted that the land would not be nationalized, but socialized. Just as they had always demanded, it would be handed over to the peasantry. In truth, the peasantry were acting on their own initiative and taking it. But the government blessed that, completely against the Bolshevik vision. And the result was a redistribution of noble and church land on a very significant scale. And the golden era of the peasant commune, Russia did become a land of commune from sea to sea. But it only became golden in the latter part of the 20s because what immediately followed was civil war.
And terror, which is the other thing that divided the Bolsheviks and the Left SRs. In a way, it's hard to talk about this because for this counterfactual to work, you sort of want the Left SRs to be as ruthless as Lenin. It feels like they're being not outplayed, but it's a battle of wills. This is a revolution. It's an epochal moment, not just in Russian history, but world history. And it is a battle of wills. And Lenin's will was pretty implacable. At the same time, part of the appeal of the Left SRs with hindsight is that they saw very early on the dangers of a reign of terror, and they suspected that the Bolsheviks were far too comfortable with terror as a tactic, as a strategy of government, than they would have been. Did they have any influence there? Were they able to rein the Bolsheviks in?
They had some influence. They insisted on, amongst the ministries they took, the commissariats they took in the coalition government, taking the Commissariat of Justice. And Steinberg, that Left SR, was determined to try to rein in the new political police, the Cheka, and the ruthless tribunals that condemned people to death very, very fast. They insisted that the tribunals of three should be unanimous before the death penalty be imposed. And they tried to just halt the death penalty being used against workers, peasants, and socialists. So I would say, and they very much entered the Cheka with the same goal. Not that the SRs were unviolent, but you're absolutely right. Their notion really was collective control from below. You do not bully the peasants and workers, and you certainly don't start killing them or fellow revolutionaries. They were pretty confident right SRs would now see the light of day and come back to them. So they restrained the Bolsheviks a bit, and they demonstrated they sure would have. We are talking about a very different outcome had they taken over the revolution. But one couldn't say that they massively, because terror began to gather pace while they were in the government.
Then in 1918, in March, the movement breaks again. The Left SRs and the Bolsheviks disagree fundamentally on the peace of Brest-Litovsk, which is Russia's exit from the war. Just describe how the break finally came in March 1918. What was it about the peace of Brest-Litovsk, which was effectively Russia's surrender to the Germans, that the Left SRs couldn't stomach?
They couldn't stomach that the Ukraine and vast areas of the former Russian Empire were being handed over to the German Empire. And German use and exploitation of, above all, the Ukraine horrified them. There was a very powerful Ukrainian SR party, and they had constant reports of the manner in which German power was being used. They were horrified, and they were much more confident than they should have been that peasant resentment and resistance would become very, very vigorous. So they wanted to end the war. They'd be just as committed to peace, but they did not want to come to some separate settlement with the hated German Empire, and they couldn't accept the terms that Lenin insisted on. Moreover, by then there were growing differences over the manner in which Lenin was trying to cope with the shortage of food in the cities, which was terrible for a government to face with, but there was the beginning of using force to take grain from peasants. The SRs couldn't stand that. And those two things, combined with terror and the sort of culture of Bolshevism, led to them resigning from the government.
And when they resigned, was there a possibility that the government itself could have collapsed? Did they resign and offer an alternative, a viable alternative to this Bolshevik revolution, which was only 5 months old at that point? And the surrender of Brest-Litovsk was absolute. The Germans were given everything that they demanded. It's either evidence, well, it's probably evidence of both Lenin's weakness and his ruthlessness, his extraordinary ruthlessness, his willingness to sign up to that abject treaty simply in order to get Russia out of the war so he could focus on what he wanted to do, which was to shore up Bolshevik power, to prosecute the civil war, and to proceed with the revolution inside Russia. Did the Left SRs offer a viable alternative to that in the spring, early summer of 1918?
They were supported in their opposition to Brest-Litovsk by very articulate left Bolsheviks who also resigned from the government in horror at Brest-Litovsk. And of course, not that they were immensely significant, but officers and other scattered remnants of privileged Russia were appalled by Brest-Litovsk. And there were elements of peasant resistance against German rule that they exaggerated, I think, and overhyped. But their opposition to it became more and more strident, and their popularity and some recovery of Menshevik popularity was very, very steep between January 18 and July 18. And they became more and more confident that they could force the government to break Brest-Litovsk, to re-enter the war, but not with a regular army, with partisan activity against the Germans. And the moment where one can really assess whether they offered a viable alternative is when the Fifth Congress of Soviets is summoned at the beginning of July 18, and they plan to force the Bolsheviks to change tack.
So what happened? Why didn't they?
Well, what happened was that as the Congress was assembling, they were pretty sure they would have a majority. This time, the peasantry would be better represented in the Congress, and they were pretty sure that they would be able to visibly, in front of all those who could be communicated amidst the chaos of Russia in 1918, see that Soviet power had forced the Bolsheviks to change tack. The Bolsheviks, Lenin was adamant there was no going back into the war, and a section of the Left SR Central Committee decided on a desperate tactic, which was to assassinate the German ambassador, and hoped that would lead to such a breakdown in trust between the German government and the Bolsheviks that they would be forced back into the war. They successfully assassinated the German ambassador, but the upshot was not what they hoped for. Lenin went groveling apology to the German embassy, and the Germans at that time weren't in a position to do a great deal to take revenge. And when the Congress assembled, one might say typical Lenin, typical Left SR, Lenin had succeeded in establishing that where the peasant Soviets had not got rid of their kulaks, their rich peasants, and where a new institution that he'd just invented called the Poor Peasant Committees were active, it was they who should be represented at the Congress, not the Soviets. Now, the Poor Peasant Committees were a real Bolshevik charade. Very few of them were working peasants. They were desperate ex-workers and ex-soldiers not having a real membership of a commune and prepared to use the authority of a fairly desperate government to try and take grain from communal peasants. That had led to appalling friction in the villages, and the Credentials Committee that decided to allow these characters to represent peasants, it was a grave charade of real peasant opinion. Moreover, during the crisis that followed the assassination, the assessment is that in Moscow, the Left SRs had perhaps 3-1 in terms of loyal soldiers, 3 loyal SR soldiers to 1 loyal Bolshevik soldier. Their potential support in the country was on a very steep rise because workers were flooding out of the cities so that the base of the Bolsheviks was shriveling, and peasants were appalled by what this government was doing. We like the Bolsheviks, we hate the communists, they were beginning to say, as Lenin had rechristened the Bolsheviks, because the grain was being taken by force. And, what the SRs were determined on was to re-enter the war, not in alliance with the West. Well, 10 days later, the last German offensive ground to a halt. Within a month, the Allies in the West were sweeping the Germans backwards. Within 4 months, the Germans had surrendered. And the notion that you either have a traditional war or collapse, in retrospect, at the time, Lenin just looked realistic. In retrospect, it doesn't seem so obvious that it would have been stupider for Russia to have nominally re-entered without a fixed army, but with refusal to accept the terms. So close was Germany to the end of the line.
And yet the irony is almost that the timing, it was right, but it was wrong, because as you said, the attempt to force Russia back into the war required a reaction from the Germans, the assassination of the ambassador, to provoke a breakdown of relations. But the Germans by that point were weeks away from not being able to manage their own destiny at all. The German war effort was collapsing. It almost required the Germans themselves to be ready to re-enter the war with Russia, which they weren't at that point. The whole thing fell apart. In the spring of 1918, when the Germans were confident that they were going to win the war, one can imagine a circumstance in which German strength, if it was turned against the Bolsheviks, could have brought down the Bolshevik regime. But by the summer, when that was the provocation was to try and break down the relations between the Bolsheviks and the Germans, it was almost too late. Like so many of these counterfactuals, it feels like there are these tantalizing moments where the time is almost right to pull the rug out from underneath Lenin and the Bolsheviks, but it's never quite right, because it's always either a bit too early or a bit too late. So it was a bit too early in October and November and in February and in March. And then when they finally went for it in July, it was too late.
I think that's right. And of course, if one made the case too strong for the counterfactual, the question would be, well, how come it didn't happen? So we've got to make it pretty strong, but not too strong.
But it could have happened. What you've described there is something that goes against my view, my ignorant view of the Russian Revolution, which was there came a point in which everything had collapsed to the extent that only someone with Lenin's ruthlessness was able to sort of tiptoe through the wreckage, and over the course of months and then years in fighting the civil war, was able to recreate something which became a powerful centralized state. But as he tiptoed through the wreckage, he was reliant, the Bolsheviks were reliant on these other parties, these other socialists. This was a movement, a wide and, in its way, diverse movement with deep differences of opinion about the correct direction of travel. It could have happened. It feels close enough that the idea that the Russian Revolution past a certain point had to be a Bolshevik revolution, that doesn't hold in late 1917, early 1918, mid-1918. If it's true later on. So let's do the counterfactual. Say, and there are different scenarios in which this might have happened, but say the Bolshevik government had fallen and the left SRs had used their numerical power and, in some ways, their greater ideological coherence in the circumstances in which they found themselves to create a left SR Russian revolution. And that was the one that had taken hold. So first question, would they have won the Civil War? Yes.
Yes, I think it's arguable that the Civil War would have been a great deal shorter. The whites, the right-wing side of the Civil War, were amongst the politically stupidest there has ever been in Europe, alienating all sides, not just peasants. We're going to restore the landed nobility. Workers, your unions and factory committees are going to be smashed. But also national minorities. You will return to one coherent, centralized Russia as of old. And it was only a contingent set of factors that enabled the whites to get any foothold. Their armies were always outnumbered something like 10 or often 20 to 1. So determined were the peasants that the land will not be going back. But the peasants also loathed the Reds. If they had to choose, of course they'd back the Reds, but they did loathe both. Now, an SR government understood the peasants, listened to the peasants, would not have tried this disastrous experiment of poor peasant committees, which alienated peasants in a manner that Lenin within months was gravely regretting. They would also have, right at the beginning, one of the factors that leads to the whites getting some hold is this extraordinary Czech division that is trying to get back via the east, via Vladivostok, back to fight on the Western Front. It's strung out on the Siberian Railway, and trust between it and the Bolshevik government breaks down, and around it, in several cities, is formed the beginning of the White Movement. Now, when the commander on that front of Lenin's own troops heard the Left SRs are staging a new démarche in Moscow and we're going to return to war with Germany, he actually immediately betrayed the Bolsheviks, ordered the Czechs to turn round and come with him to fight the Germans. He wasn't very effective and he was quite soon assassinated. But the difference between attacking these Czechs and actually treating them as your allies is all the difference in the world. So that I think on a host of other fronts too, the West too, had Russia done that, the West's attitude to intervention, it's very complicated. You mean you are against our common enemy, the Germans, but you're not quite forming a regular army and you want a general peace. Western intervention on the side of the whites is likely to have been much less. And anyway, the whites probably wouldn't have gained a foothold long enough for it to matter. So I think first big change is a much shorter civil war with literally millions of deaths, largely through illness, but also through fighting, saved.
And therefore, if the Left SRs had won the civil war, they would presumably also, therefore, had been pretty secure in power. There wouldn't have been a Bolshevik uprising against them. The Bolsheviks were an all-or-nothing organization, weren't they? Lenin's project had to succeed, or that was it. It wasn't a popular movement that would have gone underground, bubbled away, and then come back with mass support in the way that the Left SRs at least attempted. The Bolsheviks either held central power or they were done. So had they been done in 1918, that would have been it for Bolshevism, wouldn't it?
It certainly would. The working class, which is their base, and the organized army, the army just melts, disappears, leaves the working class, and it shrinks in a manner that's sort of Black Death scale. It shrinks so fast. The cities are emptied. So no way without the control of an emergent, very brutal state could the Bolsheviks have made a comeback. Even controlling things as they did, once the Civil War at last receded, the policy they initially adopted very reluctantly, known as the New Economic Policy, is very Left SR. You bring together the peasants and the workers. You allow the peasant commune to work. You allow peasant communes to sell grain for a profit. The SRs thought, of course you do. But for the Bolsheviks, was an almighty stretch, and Lenin had to use all his authority to allow that amount of the use of the market. And under Left SRs, one would envisage that the Bolshevik attempts to raise loans in the West during the 1920s to industrialize would have had far more chance of working. A Left SR government based on peasants isn't very frightening to a Western industrialized Europe. It's something else. The Bolshevik project portrayed itself as and was seen as something completely exportable to the most urban industrial society. Not so the SRs. So I think the prospect is a sort of Left SR equivalent of the new economic policy that succeeds in raising Western loans. Maybe the West gets more power than some socialists would like, but it avoids the horrors that followed. Above all, forced collectivization, unthinkable. The opposite of what the SRs exist for, forcibly collectivizing the peasants against their every instinct. And then forced industrialization involving exporting grain, leading to millions of starvation in the Ukraine, and the use of terror throughout, forfeiting Western trust. I think the prospect for Russia itself is transformative.
The impact that the Bolsheviks had on, well, the whole of the 20th century was twofold. On the one hand, this is the great inspiration for socialist revolutionaries around the world. Lenin becomes the template, the model for what a successful revolution looks like. Bolshevism becomes the byword for that. And socialist parties around the world have to orient themselves to this increasingly powerful regime, the Bolshevik regime, the Soviet regime. On the other hand, he is the bogeyman for everyone else in the West. Bolshevism becomes the byword for terror and for the threat that Russia poses to the wider world, because, as you say, this is a movement that is built on its inherent exportability. This is a movement that can take hold in any urban centre where there is an angry and alienated working class, whereas the left SR revolution, as you described it, would have been seen as distinctively Russian. So with not too big a tweak to Russian history in late 1917, early 1918, we get a completely different 20th century, don't we? A left SR. We don't want to suggest that the left SRs were not ruthless revolutionaries, because they were. The fact that they were opposed to terror, opposed to collectivization, doesn't mean these weren't tough and many of them violent revolutionaries. But their revolution would not have had the impact on the wider world that the Bolshevik Revolution did, which, after all, in a way, the Bolshevik Revolution created the 20th century. It created all of the far-right reactions to it. I don't know how far we can go with this counterfactual, whether with a left SR revolution you don't get Hitler, but maybe you don't.
I think you don't. And I think it's much easier with counterfactuals to identify what you don't get than what you do get. But a left SR Russia that is successfully borrowing from the West and that is not massacring its own officer corps is a far more likely diplomatic ally as revanchist Germany begins to threaten, even with Stalin there, even with all the horrors and unfathomable, unknown things. There are very serious talks about re-establishing an entente between France and the Soviet Union, and later on, even between Britain and the Soviet Union. But that is a Soviet Union that is the exact bogey you've just described. An SR Soviet regime would be a completely different animal. And I think the prospect of no Second World War and no Holocaust, if you had a left SR government, that repercussion seems to me extremely easy to demonstrate. You're also right that the impact if you look at across Southern and Western Europe, the impact on politics was enormous. The left everywhere became divided between those who would join Comintern, form a communist party, look to the USSR as the socialist homeland, and those socialists who would not. And it became a chasm. If you think of France, if you think of Germany, if you think of Southeast Europe, it became a chasm and gravely weakening the left in general. I think if one tries to sort of encapsulate the effect, it was to make it extremely difficult for socialists to combine a socialist vision of the future with patriotism. It was the Bolshevik Revolution and the dominance of the USSR as the godfather of communist parties that enabled the right, which had really lost its grip on patriotism immediately after the war, to regain it. And that fusion of nationalism and anti-socialism that really does shape the world that crashed into the late 30s and the Second World War.
And you even see that in the United Kingdom. The episode that we recorded about the general election of 1924 and the ways in which Bolshevism was used as a tool by the Conservatives to paint Ramsay MacDonald's Labour administration as a threat to Britain, as a potentially traitorous organisation. I take from what you're saying that the difference that a left SR Russian revolution would have made would have been its quintessential Russianness would have made that almost absurd to, by the time you've stretched the question of what socialism is to Britain in the 1920s, the idea that Ramsay MacDonald might somehow have been trying to tap in to left SR peasant Russian revolutionary politics. A Labour government might, as you say, have made loans to that regime as it tried to make to the Bolshevik regime, but that would have been a pragmatic question. The idea that somehow by association, that connection would have meant that Ramsay MacDonald or a Labour government in Britain was inherently unpatriotic and a danger, a threat to British national interest because the Bolsheviks are the Bolsheviks. The left SRs aren't that, are they?
No. I think that's absolutely right, David. And I think it's illuminating to pull out Britain, where actually the impact of this Red Terror is less than almost anywhere else in Europe. But even here, it's pretty potent. And at the point, yes, your podcast on 24, it evidently mattered a great deal. The Labour Party managed to continue to combine a sort of socialist-ish program with patriotism far better than other countries in Europe, where it became very, very difficult. And it was a gift to the right, where you see the right wing regain the initiative right across Southern Europe. Overwhelmingly, what fills their rhetoric is the Bolshevik, unpatriotic threat of the left.
And you could say, no Bolshevism, no Hitler, but no Bolshevism, no Churchill. I mean, obviously no Churchill because no Hitler, no Churchill as a national leader, but also that version of anti-Bolshevik politics, which became so powerful in so many different settings. It does almost sound like, one could say, I have to hesitate with these counterfactuals to overdo it. But as you said a few moments ago, in the aftermath of the First World War, the right, as a broad term, but the right in politics was exposed, and the tide seemed to be with the left. And yet the 20th century in Europe and elsewhere, and in the United States, was a century where the parties of the right tended to dominate. And part of the reason they tended to dominate was that Bolshevism gave them a weapon to beat the left with. If you take that weapon away, maybe what you get is a 20th century dominated by the parties of the left.
I think very, very likely. And I often reflect, but I don't know if you would agree, David, that you've worded it exactly rightly. The 20th century is, in Europe, often, much of the time, dominated by parties of the right. But if you ask the question, who won the 20th century in Europe, left or right? The left walked it. Look at the manifestos of parties in any country you want in 1914 and see by 1991 which vision is more closely realized. The left on every front. But because political parties of the right dominated so often, it's not what people think. People think, oh no, the right must have won it. You know, the right would be horrified by female enfranchisement, by the level of regulation, by the rights of workers that have been achieved across the continent. It's not inevitable, and one might say from the last couple of decades of the 20th century, there are elements where the right begins to regain some ground. But centrally, the left wins. I think looking beyond Europe, there is also very profound repercussion of the counterfactual. The Cold War is rooted in the interwar period. It's rooted in what you've just been summarizing, the loathing and the fear of communism. And the impact of that infusing in Western and above all American minds, nationalism and communism, and confusing them to the point of thinking, if there's rebellion against the status quo, it must be communist, when so often it was actually nationalist. That wouldn't have arisen. And the sort of model held out to third world countries asserting their independence. An SR model is a profoundly different thing. If you think of the way so many African countries have wasted the political capital of new independence, pursuing a sort of mad idea about how you develop agriculture with the Russian image, the Soviet collectivization image, the dominant aspiration. Not so with the left SR Soviet regime.
One could almost say that the direction that the 20th century was heading in, we know with hindsight, was on the one hand, nationalism over internationalism, and on the other hand, policies broadly of the left over the right, as you said, workers' rights, welfare state. But it's so hard to see because of Bolshevism. Bolshevism is the thing that obscures the underlying truth. Maybe we can see it more clearly now in the 21st century. But in the 20th century, these two things are at odds. The dominant narrative, which is the narrative of what became the Cold War and the contest between the Soviets and the West, and the underlying story where there's far greater coming together, because in most places what you got were two things which are incompatible in a Bolshevik world, which are nationalism and center-left policies. So Bolshevism is the great illusion of the 20th century. And the left SRs would have shattered that illusion.
I think absolutely, absolutely. So many elements that my generation grew up thinking of sort of in the nature of things were extremely contingent. And where, because the authority of the Bolshevik government and the ideological commitment that they made to insist this is the description of world history and the world's destiny was so effective, so effective. So the energy we all devoted to unpicking it, that would have all been saved without the Bolsheviks triumphing and the Left SRs with a far more plastic reading of history and huge emphasis on the uniqueness of Russia.
A reminder that if you would like to hear the second part of our conversation with Chris Clark, it is available as a bonus episode. And to get that, you need to sign up to PPF Plus. It's very easy. Just follow the link in our show description or go to our new website, ppfideas.com. You'll get that and all of our bonus episodes, 24 a year, for just £5 a month or £50 for an annual subscription. Do sign up now. Coming next in our What If series, I'm going to be talking to another historian of the First World War, Margaret Macmillan, the author of Peacemakers. And we're going to be talking about how the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 could have turned out differently. What if we'd been nicer to the Germans? What if the Americans had fully embraced the League of Nations? How might history have been different? Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.